stabdyti jau šitą.
Taip,
Tai jau pasiruošęs?
aš taip žinoma.
Viskas, stabdžiu.
Anatolijus. Sveikas, Anatolijus.
Labą dieną.
Labas, Anatolijus.
Kada galima? Labą dieną. Džiaugiuosi, kad šiandien
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for meeting, especially those people who really care about the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Today in Lithuania, we celebrate the restoration of freedom. And here we are in a very special hall of the Seimas because this hall reminds us the main freedoms and human rights. Today it is a great day to speak about the freedoms of our neighbors and friends in Belarus and their ability to use and enjoy the same rights. Today we discuss the threat of authoritarianism for the freedom of speech and expression in the case of Belarus. Today this is a joint conference of the Seimas, of the European Parliament and the Lithuanian Journalists Union. 3 languages are available. Use the opportunity to do that through your Zoom platform. Today we have representatives in person and also those connected online. I'm actually the moderator of the conference. And first of all, I would like to give the floor
kurios yra šiandieną priešakyje
to the
ne tik
leaders
mūsų temos,
that
bet ir
are
mūsų
in
temos.
front of our
Nes ir gerbiama Viktorija
topic
Čmilytė
and
Nilsen,
other
Lietuvos
topics.
Respublikos Seimo
Both
pirmininkė
the
ir
Speaker
Svetlana
of the
Tikhanovskaja,
Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania and the leader of Democratic Belarus constantly speak about
žodžio ir
the
saviraiškos
freedom
laisvę. Taigi kviečiu
of speech and
sveikinimo
freedom of
žodžiui
expression of all the
Viktoriją
people.
Čmilytę Nilsen,
Therefore, I
Lietuvos
give the
Respublikos
floor
Seimo
to
pirmininkė.
Victoria Čmilytė Nilsen, Speaker of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We started this week with the World Press Freedom Day. It is symbolic that today, on the day of the restoration of the Lithuanian press, language and book, we participate in an international conference on the threat to self-expression and freedom of expression in Belarus. I say symbolic because the Lithuanian nation, more than 100 years ago, itself experienced what it means banning press, free speech and censorship. As early as 1948, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights affirmed that everyone had the right to freely observe and express his or her beliefs, and this right shall include the freedom to have an unhindered opinion and so to seek, receive, and disseminate information and ideas by any means and regardless of state
Per pastaruosius 70 metų atsirado daugiau galimybių įvairesnių būdų informacijai skleisti, savo nuomonę ir poziciją išsakyti. Tačiau puikiai žinome, kad ir šiandien kai kuriuose šalyse ribojamas ir cenzūruojamas laisvas žodis, o jį skleidžianti žiniasklaida neretai sulaukia išpuolių ir represijų. Kita vertus, pandemijos metu visame pasaulyje padaugėjo skleidžiamos dezinformacijos, netikrų naujienų, kurios išbalansuoja ir skaldo visuomenę, pamina demokratijos prizmę, galų gale kelia pavojų piliečių sveikatai. Taigi tarptautinės bendruomenės dėmesys turėtų būti sutelktas į kovą su dezinformacija, su klaidinančiu ir neteisėtu turiniu.
misleading and illegal content, interference with the free right of expression and getting correct information. I sincerely wish that the tools of this fight be found at this conference dedicated to the World Press Freedom Day. I'm looking forward to meaningful and productive conference. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker of the Seimas. While this is a great introduction, but we have to have 2 introductions. Therefore, I'd like to give the floor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaja, the leader of the Belarusian opposition.
Šiuo metu dar nėra prisijungusi.
She has not yet online. She hasn't joined us.
Svetlana, are you in the room? jungiasi. Tai gera žinia, kad konferencija
She's
tęsiasi.
connecting while the conference
Gerbiamas
is
Svetlana
to
prisijungė.
continue.
Taip pat prašau,
Ms.
kviečiu
Tikhanovska
tarti sveikinimo
has
žodį arba
joined us,
man
and
labiau
therefore I
patiktų
would
turbūt
like
sakyti
to give
įžanginį
the
žodį.
floor to Svetlana
Svetlana,
Tikhanovska
screen is
to
yours,
make
please.
the introductory remarks.
Gerbiamas Svetlana, ar galima būtų paprašyti įsijungti mikrofoną?
Madam Tikhanovska, could you please switch on your microphone and your camera?
Okay, Svetlana, can you...
Do you see me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Welcome. Finally. Please, the screen is yours, really.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for the possibility to speak before you today. It's precisely 1 year ago, on May 7th, 2020, that my husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky, announced his decision to run for president of Belarus. He wasn't affiliated to any political party or structure. He only had his independent blog in YouTube. The videos where Sergei interviewed Belarusians about their everyday problems happened to have a tremendous mobilizing effect. Thousands of citizens across the country saw that they are not alone and joined the movement to support Sergei and later me. And during the last year, our movement has completely changed Belarus and Belarusians, and it's not going to stop until the decisive victory of democracy. This story proves the strength of the media. They are more than just the source of information. The media can change the society itself. At some point, Belarusians started to prefer the diverse and professional independent media to the centralized state propaganda. When the regime finally understood it, the only thing it could do was to get revenge on the independent journalists. Belarus has become the most dangerous country in Europe for journalists, where they can be fined, arrested, beaten, or even shot for doing their job. Repressive laws are introduced to legalize this professional ban. But this has only led to the greater demand for independent information among Belarusians, and the prosecuted journalists are already treated as heroes. I especially mean such political prisoners as Igor Losik, Mykola Didok, Katerina Andreeva, Daria Chultsova, Katerina Borisevich, and others who defy the regime even being in jail. The journalists of such media as Tutbay, Nasha Niva, Belsat, Radio Svoboda, and others continue working despite the conditions and without compromising quality. Meanwhile, the grassroots media infrastructure continues to develop, especially the network of Telegram channels. And there is even the return of samizdat with dozens of self-made newspapers across the country. The Belarusian society supports the independent media, but they also need support from the international community. I invite us all to discuss what can be done for that, putting this issue in the broader context of the defense of human rights and keeping in mind the perspective of the future development of Belarus. I hope that today we can have a fruitful exchange on those matters. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. And once again, we need to start our conference with very important topics. And I will switch to Lithuanian, but please don't forget, we have 3 languages today: Ruski, English ir lietuviškai. Taigi, mano darbas, kaip minėjau, labai paprastas ir sąlyginai lengvas.
Well, my work is rather simple here today to moderate the conference, and now we are going to have the session entitled Human Rights in Belarus, Challenges and Solutions, which is extremely important indeed. Petras Auštrevičius is my old acquaintance and friend who clearly understands that politicians and journalists have extremely important job today. So I invite Mr. Petras to moderate as a politician and be honest as a journalist.
Ačiū už tokius gražus palinkėjimus.
Thank you, Danius. Thank you for your trust and your wishes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to start the first session of our conference here today. And the fact that this conference is organized together with Dalia Asanavičiūtė, member of the Lithuanian Seimas, and also the Lithuanian Journalists Union, shows that Lithuania is a democratic country. We are talking with journalists, with the ones who analyze the situation and criticize. And I am happy that we can work together very closely when we need to fight for defense of human rights, especially in the places where they are not respected. In the course of 27 years, Alexander Lukashenko managed not only to create a repressive system, but also to make us get used to human rights violations in Belarus. It seems as if nothing new is happening. However, what we see in the course of last 9 or 10 months is shocking, because we see a new wave of the violation of basic human rights and freedoms, and saying that the situation is developing from bad to worse would not be an exaggeration. One thing is very important here, the elimination of inviolability, so that everyone who commits crimes against human rights in Belarus should feel free and do not face any threat of legitimate actions. I really have the pleasure to give the floor to Žygimantas Pavilionis, member of the Seimas, head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, the person who is the initiator of the Kalinovsky conference, a very important and interesting event. And I invite Mr. Žygimantas Pavilionis, asking to keep to 7 minutes time frame, if you can. Žygimantas, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Petras, Darius, Dalia, friends, the ones who are not here with us in the hall, but who are observing this conference remotely. We have been meeting and discussing it for several times already, and I agree with Petras and Dalia that we just must to continue our discussions, especially now, when the repressions in Belarus have reached such a level that people feel intimidated and fear to fight for their rights. Politicians, unfortunately, tend to react to major events, and if we don't see them now, it's because of the repressions, the level of repressions. And it is namely today, when everyone's attention is mainly focused on Ukraine, we just must to stop the silence, to break the silence. And speaking on the positive note, our activities have led to some political results. As mentioned before during the press conference, today we are not acting alone as it used to be in the past, talking about Belarusian freedom. The whole democratic world is with us today. The principles that we have been repeating here belong to everyone now. So on the political level, we do have a coalition, and I'm speaking about powerful states, countries that have a lot of political tools for forcing Lukashenko, even Putin, to step away and not to hurt people. However, very strong political will is required, and we must take actions. The fourth package of sanctions must be introduced. We see that Lukashenko is afraid of that package. He is trying to threaten with statements about shutting down all foreign companies, Western companies. and do other things. And we see that he is afraid. This is why we should apply this. I believe that foreign ministers come back from Brussels with the positive news that the decisions are going to be taken shortly. However, we who are here in Vilnius, who have always been supporting this fight for freedom on all levels, should do everything to make these words shift into deeds. It's a good thing that the US ambassador is going to reside in Vilnius now. We are looking forward to her return. We very much hope that Chancellor Merkel will be with us, and that we will all stand together with Washington, with Vilnius. I also believe that the Swedish democracy, who have been supporting us so much in our fight, who are presiding over the OSCE now, will have determination to open one more historical page, similarly to what OSCE did, trying to make Russia to withdraw its army from Lithuania, so that we will have democratic new elections in Belarus. I hope that President Biden, when meeting with Putin in June, will speak not about Ukraine only, but also about Belarus, so that Putin understands that he may face this risk, a big threat. The measures have been already named in the Senate, in the US Congress, with respect not to high-level officials, but also the huge companies, banks. We can do it, and we must do it, in my view. Therefore, let me ask everyone who have all the leverages, come together and not allow the freedom to be quenched, because it's going to be our common responsibility if this happens. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Paviljonis, and thank you for reminding us that we are collectively responsible, because we are all signatories to the conventions. It is not us who must uphold those conventions, but we have to hold others responsible for upholding these conventions. It is a pleasure for me to give the floor to Mr. Rastok Kužel, who is an expert of media and elections. He has more than 20-year experience. Since 1998, Mr. Kužel has been heading the NGO Memo 98. This is Memo 98 is organization helps people to get truthful information about public policy and aims at giving accurate information to people in order to strengthen their critical thinking. Mr. Kužel, the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very good, very good. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to participate in today's event. As it was already mentioned, I'm a media and election expert who has spent last 2 decades focusing on human rights, particularly in the context of elections in a number of countries, including Belarus. In fact, Belarus was my first foreign country where I worked back in 1998 with the Belarusian Association of Journalists and other organizations. And so it's great to see Andrei here and looking forward to hearing also from him a little bit later. Since 1999, I have worked intensively with the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, observing elections in a number of countries of the OSCE region. It is with this background that I was asked to share my insights on the historical assessment on how human rights and freedoms changed, specifically looking at the freedom of expression before and after elections. I reviewed all audio reports on Belarus since 2001, as they serve as a very good source when it comes to providing any historical assessment of the human rights situation prior to elections. Moreover, it is obviously important to mention the crucial work done by Human Rights Center Vyasna, Belarusian Association of Journalists, Belarusian Press Club, and many other local organizations. Following the last year's elections in Belarus, 17 OSCE participating states invoked the Moscow mechanism with regard to credible reports of human rights violations before, during, and after the election, in results of which OSCE rapporteur Professor Wolfgang Benedek was tasked to analyze the situation and produced an excellent report which includes important recommendations to the Republic of Belarus, to the OSCE, and to the international community. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from him as well. Due to the limited time, I will focus only on some challenges and offer some possible solutions. It is important to say that in a number of authoritarian countries, the concept of elections as a genuine competition is absent, as they are taken as a tool to confirm the existing form of governance, giving it some clout of international legitimacy. Suppressing such genuine competition, there is an overall disregard for fundamental freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. All these fundamental freedoms deteriorate prior and after elections when it comes to freedom of expression. This means that a genuine debate is absent in the media, and attempts to simulate it are done, for example, in the form of free airtime allocation by state media. But even this free airtime or space has been censored and edited to prevent direct criticism of incumbents. Any attempt by media to provide independent views and opinions on the performance of incumbents are punished or restricted. The historical overview shows that such actions were first focused on traditional media, such as television, radio, or print, and more recently, as we saw it also in the last year's elections, on the so-called new media, such as internet or social media. Such punishment or restrictions include physical and psychological intimidation and harassment. On the other side, state media in particular provide massive institutional coverage of incumbents, highlighting achievements and successes. For example, during the last year's elections, Lukashenko again used the state TV to portray himself as a hard-working president, taking care of the needs of the people, while unnamed opponents were distracting him from running of the country. Elections are coming and going, but everyone wants to eat. Elections are secondary, while the bread is always necessary, he said. In 2010, for the first time in Belarus, there were two debates which gave candidates the opportunity to address the electorate directly. Free airtime was provided in an uncensored format, although it was limited in scope and time. It should be mentioned, however, that Lukashenko did not take part in these debates, sending his representatives instead. In 2012, the ODIHR final report concluded that although the Constitution guarantees freedom of expression and prohibits censorship, candidates who called for an election boycott had their free airtime denied or censored. In 2015, 16, and 19, elections saw repetition of the above-mentioned problems, with media coverage of the campaign not enabling voters to receive sufficient information about contestants. Last year, we saw a new law when ODIHR was not able to deploy an observation mission for the first time in 20 years, in result of which there was no credible international in-country observation. When it comes to possible solutions, one has to be realistic and recognize that they very much depend on the situation on the ground. As such, I'm not going to focus now on the systematic changes which are necessary when it comes to state media reforms, media regulation, and legislation. In this respect, the mentioned ODIHR reports, as well as the reports by previously mentioned local organizations, provide a very good baseline. I will focus more on a few recommendations for international community, which I believe are essential. I believe it is important for the international community to continue insisting on new presidential election under international monitoring and to provide technical assistance for the preparation, as reiterated by G7 meeting of foreign ministers in London the day before yesterday. It is also important to provide assistance to journalists and others who had to leave the country. But most importantly, and I conclude here, it is vital to continue providing support to human rights defenders and civil society organizations promoting and protecting human rights on the ground. I will stop here, but very happy to take any questions or explain any points later.
Aš dėkoju ponui Kuželiui už jo pasisakymą, tikrai klausimų bus.
Thank you to Mr. Kasto Kužel. We will have certainly questions later. And now I give the floor to Mr. Vytas Jurkonis, a well-known expert in Lithuania. However, while introducing him, I would like to mention that he is the director of Freedom House projects, the lecturer of Vilnius University, international science politician. So, Vytas, please, 7 minutes about the wide region, if you can. Thank you. Indeed, Freedom House has released several annual reports this year, seeking to assess the situation of freedom and democracy in the world. And I have to state that Belarus, both in the Freedom and the World report, as well as another report that measures the level of democracy in our region, the grades of democracy have dropped significantly indeed. As a matter of fact, the situation in Belarus has been quite in a bad situation for several years. It has been an authoritarian country, but now it started resembling some Central Asian country situation because of the brutal control of its citizens, of the journalists today. And even though 1 year ago we thought it has reached the bottom, I see that it's not the end yet. And in our assessment scale, it has reached respectively 5 and 11 point levels, which is really very impressive in the negative sense. I already offered during the Kalinovsky conference a formula which relates to elections, accountability, partnership for transition formula. Even in Lithuanian, when we speak about the Eastern Partnership, so elections and partnership is coded there also. There were some solutions adopted, even though Belarusians may believe that what Europe is doing is not enough, and we probably agree with that. However, on the other hand, we have to also acknowledge that the attention, the focus is quite big. Professor Wolfgang Benedict stated that in the Belarusian case, the solutions were taken in at a record speed, which means that sometimes we can act in a determined manner. An important mechanism has been also established in terms of dignity platform. There is also Anais Maham, a special rapporteur on the issues of human rights, who is acting here in Vilnius. On the initiative of our parliamentarians, we have the Justice House. This is why accountability mechanism is really pushed forward. However, in the view of the scale of repressions, we have to act faster and to defend Belarusian citizens, because tens of thousands of people who have been detained, who have been made to flee their country, they cannot be happy just with our solidarity and or recommendations. They are waiting for concrete steps and the implementation of the recommendations. So what we can do is the pressure on the regime in every possible way through international platforms, be it OSCE, the United Nations, or any other. The Belarus is not a European community member, but nevertheless we can speak to international law experts and find ways to force the representatives of the Belarusian regime to take accountability for the repressions. Lithuania and Germany, as well as some other countries, are trying to apply the universal jurisdiction mechanism, which is of key importance in putting an end to inviolability that is flourishing in Belarus today. So the pressure on the regime also requires targeted sanctions. Sanctions on the regime itself, sanctions on those who are the main actors of the regime, as well as monetary sanctions, who are financing the repressions by using smuggling of cigarettes and other things. We have to do this not only because we support the determination of Belarusian people, but also because those people are also active in our countries, Lithuania, Poland, and elsewhere. Another important point is the support to civil society, including the financial, moral support. However, another big commitment that we have been discussing largely, a Marshall Plan for Belarus, because we understand very well that the Kremlin is the key actor there, and the Belarusian economy is hugely dependent on those huge subsidies. The time will come when we will have to ensure that that narrow wind of opportunities will be opened. And then we should be ready to help to implement all the reforms, field of energy, economy, e-governance, including Poland and Estonia. We do have capabilities, and we just need very important decisions here and now, instead of just observing how the situation may evolve. We have to give this message to Belarusian people as well, because hundreds of thousands of people who have stormed into the streets understand very well that they are risking a lot, and they should see their goal, main goal, and perceive that what they are seeking is a realistic thing. And when the time comes, all the European states and community is going to support them. We have to send them this message.
I thank Vytis, and now I give the floor to Professor Benedek. Those who read the report by a professor initiated by the OEC can see that Professor is highly qualified and he is professional. I will remind you that Professor is
Europos žmogaus teisių ir demokratijos mokymų ir tyrimų centro įkūrėjas ir vienas iš jo direktorių.
One of the directors and founder of the Human Rights Law in Graz University in Austria. So the floor is yours, Professor. Those who listen to you really appreciate, and therefore we are looking for your presentation. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank for the invitation to this important conference taking place on such a historic day for Lithuania. On 17 September 2020, the Moscow mechanism of the human dimension of OSCE was invoked by 17 participating states with regard to credible reports of human rights violations before, during and after the presidential elections of 9 August 2020 in the Republic of Belarus. My mandate as rapporteur was defined as to establish the facts and to give advice on possible solutions to the questions raised, which were defined as intimidation and persecution of political activists, candidates, journalists, media actors, lawyers, labor activists, and human rights defenders, as well as the detention of prospective candidates, election fraud, restriction on access to information, including internet shutdowns, excessive use of force against peaceful protesters, arbitrary and unlawful arrests or detentions, beatings, sexual and gender violence, abductions and enforced disappearances, torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and widespread impunity for all of the above. One chapter of the report was devoted to freedom of expression and the media, as well as the right of access to information. Here, the freedom of expression and information in Belarus is being analyzed with a focus on the presidential elections of 9 August 2020 and the events thereafter. This includes also the online dimension of the freedom, and for this purpose, the access to the internet. Specific attention is put on the right to safety of journalists. Regarding freedom of expression and information in the context of the elections, the report found excessively restrictive rules on accreditation, already pointed out by the United Nations and by the OSCE for a long time. For example, in the context of elections, the authorities did deprive at least 19 journalists of accreditation, whereas some 50 foreign journalists were denied accreditation or deported. Several popular bloggers were prosecuted under the criminal code, in particular Article 342, during the election campaign. Among them, Sergei Tikhanovsky. Also, after the elections, critical bloggers faced persecution. In protest to the rigged elections, a number of public media workers resigned or stopped working, facing personal consequences. Regarding the right of access to information, including the problem of internet shutdowns, the existing obligation under the United Nations and OSCE commitments not to disrupt access to or dissemination of information online have been systematically ignored. For example, amendments of the law on the mass media introduced on 14 June 2018 to regulate national and foreign media, as well as providing the Minister of Information with strict control over online resources, were denounced by the OSCE representative on the freedom of the media as excessive and disproportionate. My report observed that there was a complete blackout of the internet in the nights of 9 to 12 September 2020 on landlines and also on mobile phones, while later there were short-term interruptions of service. However, during the protests on the following weekends, mobile internet was restricted outside of houses at specific locations for certain times related to the protests. Mobile internet service providers had to respond to the requests from authorized state bodies. In addition, access to some 70 websites was restricted inside Belarus with both harmful societal and economic consequences. Both situations exist until today. For example, the very informative website of human rights NGO Vyazna, Spring96.org, which I frequently used for my report, was blocked in Belarus since the election protests, while it is like other blocked websites freely accessible from the outside. As another example, the Ministry of Information of Belarus suspended the status of a mass media of one of the most popular internet news portals, which is Tut.bi. The Committee to Protect Journalists lists Belarus among the 10 most censored countries worldwide. According to the World Press Freedom Index maintained by Reporters Without Borders, Belarus presently ranks 153 out of 180 countries. The US NGO Freedom House categorizes the internet in Belarus as not free because of obstacles to access, limits on content, and violations of user rights. The blockades of the internet also prevent people to meet online and thus violate the freedom of assembly online as part of the freedom of assembly. The recent draft law passed by the Belarusian parliament will further aggravate the restrictions and facilitate censorship even further. However, the Constitution of Belarus in Article 33 guarantees the freedom of expression and specifically states that no censorship shall be permitted. Regarding the safety of journalists, the OSCE Ministerial Council in 2018, with the consent of Belarus, adopted an important decision according to which political leaders and authorities have to refrain from intimidating, threatening, or condoning violence against journalists, since serious violations of the commitments contained in these commonly adopted standards could be observed. Already during the election process, there were many reports on violations and harassment of media workers. When they covered the protests, many were attacked and detained. Individual citizens documenting police brutality with photos or videos, so-called citizen journalists, were arrested and sentenced to several days of detention, if not more. The Association of Belarusian Journalists keeps a list of all journalists arrested and will inform about recent figures. It has produced detailed reports, which I also used for my investigation. In any case, allegations according to which journalists doing their work are sanctioned for reporting about demonstrations have been found confirmed, which constitutes a major violation of the rights of journalists who have a right to report on the events. Journalists were beaten and detained like protesters. In spite of pointing out press status, they ended up in detention and suffered serious ill treatment. The police arbitrarily destroyed part of the footage and threatened to destroy also the equipment. With regard to foreign journalists, there are special sanctions like deprivation of accreditation and deportation in combination with a ban from re-entering Belarus. Accordingly, several media were not allowed to report on the elections from Belarus. As a result of the EU sanctions, President Lukashenko announced to withdraw all accreditations of foreign journalists. If they work without accreditation, the authorities can deport them with a ban on re-entry. In addition, local collaborators are prohibited to work for foreign media which do not have accreditation. Otherwise, they risk high fines. Having found major violations of the freedom of expression and information as well as of the safety of journalists, as requested by my mandate, I have made several recommendations to the government how to address the situation described. In particular, I recommended to ensure the safety of all journalists and refrain from any persecution related to the performance of their duties, seizure of and damage to equipment and footage, to facilitate and deregulate the accreditation of foreign journalists, to refrain from interference with the access to the internet, including the mobile one, and terminate censorship and blocking of web pages, as well as any restrictions on bloggers, to de-restrict the some 70 web pages blocked at a time, to end the obligation of all media outlets to keep records of and disclose to authorities the names of people who submit comments, as well as the criminal liability of owners of registered online media for any content on their website. Obviously, many other recommendations, like those on fair trial or against impunity, do also apply. I am glad to see that the issue of freedom of expression and media freedom in Belarus has gained much international attention, like the ARIA Formula meeting of the Security Council of the United Nations in January 2021, organized by Estonia and supported by Lithuania. I hope that the formation of an international media freedom coalition or the awards given to the Belarusian Association of Journalists and the events of today will in the end have a positive effect on the situation of freedom of expression in Belarus. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dėkuoju, profesoriau.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for your extremely interesting insights and your presentations. Now we just have a few minutes, and then I would like to ask you to formulate very short answers, maybe 1.5 minutes if you can. I would like to start from Professor Benedict. Your presentation, in particular the conclusions, I believe all the participants of this conference could sign them, because they are really correct. What was the formal institutional reaction of the Belarusian authorities to your statement? And what can we expect from OSCE in the future in terms of institutional activities, so that your recommendations are implemented or considered at least? Professor, if you can.
Thank you very much for this question. I think you are all aware that the Belarusian government decided not to cooperate on my mission, and therefore they also refused to give any official response to my recommendations. However, there were several international meetings in the United Nations, the already mentioned Security Council meeting, and so on, where Belarusian diplomats responded indirectly to my findings. And you will not be surprised to hear that they largely denounced them as exaggerated and did not want to recognize them as such. However, the evidence is so overwhelming that there can be no doubt on the problems existing on the ground, and we are going to hear much more about it in the next session anyway. With regard to OSCE, there is the representative on the freedom of the media, which already in the past has made several statements regarding the situation in Belarus, and also recently again. In this way, the OSCE institution in charge of media freedom and safety of journalists is speaking out from time to time on the situation on the ground, and they are also monitoring this situation. Certainly, they have their limits because the OSCE is a consensus institution, and decisions of the OSCE political bodies are therefore difficult against the position of Belarus, Russia, and their friends. However, this monitoring is taking place, and as much as the representative on the freedom of the media is concerned, she is able to speak out, and this is also happening.
Ačiū profesoriau dar kartą ir aš labai prašau visų konferencijos dalyvių.
Thank you, Professor.
Toliau stebėti situaciją Baltarusijoje.
On behalf of all the participants of this conference, I pledge you to continue such steps, especially the monitoring, because all these actions do have a very important effect on the situation. Now I would like to ask Vytis Jurkonis a short question, maybe. The recent ratings in Belarus, everything seems that we have reached the bottom. What about the state television then? How does it comment the situation? What have you noticed? What are the answers given by Belarusian authorities or even decisions in that effect? Well, I believe we have to compare of the reaction 5 years ago, when the situation was not still that gloomy. The Belarusian authorities still tried to find some justification because they needed positive figures about progress when talking to Europe. So there have been many manipulations until now. Today, everyone sees how bad the situation is, and there is no absolutely need for denial. However, the Belarusian authorities don't seem to even have illusions about any dialogue, any possible dialogue. And this is why they try to manipulate, they try to state that the Western democracies try to pose some geopolitical challenge, whatever. But what we see is a clear fight between democracy and authoritarian regime against the terror. So we shouldn't have any doubts on which side we have to be on. Sometimes we just have to encourage our colleagues of international community that we need to stand for democracy, for human rights, because this is what we are. We are the basis of Europe. Thank you, Vytis. I would like to ask Resto Kužel. You rightly mentioned that the independent media, elimination of this media, arrests and other measures have left state media as dominating in the country. How could you comment the evolution of the state media, even that some journalists representing it also faced repressions? However, how would you in general describe the evolution of state media in the course of the last 9 months? Mr. Kužel.
Thank you very much for this question. I think what we have seen is really, and I think what I would just like to, in a way, reiterate, is that the regime tried to use the same methods as in all the previous elections. So in fact, Lukashenko ran an analog campaign in a digital age, so to say. So again, relying very much on the state TV propaganda. And in that sense, we haven't really seen any big sort of developments, when I look at the historical perspective, when I look at the previous years and the previous elections. I think very importantly, after the elections, we saw that there were some journalists on state television that basically refused to continue, which in a way reminded me of a similar situation, for example, in Ukraine after 2004 during the Orange Revolution. So I think this was a very important signal that not everyone is ready to sort of do this type of blatant propaganda. At the same time, what we see nowadays is continuation of this propaganda, describing the protesters as extremists and terrorists, using emotions to sort of paint a picture which is of huge contrast. And I'm sure that maybe Andrei will talk a little bit more about this as Belarusian Association of Journalists is doing monitoring into this respect. So maybe just very briefly to respond to your question.
Dėkoju, ponas Kužel, už jūsų komentarą.
Thank you, Mr. Kužel. Now I address Mr. Žygimantas Pavilionis. You mentioned that it was no coincidence that Lithuania, together with Poland, is taking a lot of initiatives. Can we expect anything new in this field? While seeing that the fourth package of sanctions is inevitable, what can we expect on the regional level in terms of political initiative? Well, I just expect one strong action, one firm step, which is the active involvement of the new US administration, which is the power that can make Putin retreat, because they have all the necessary tools. This is what I hope for, and I very much hope that will be implemented by the meeting between Biden and Putin in June this year. A short answer. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have had an honor to moderate this part of our discussion. Thank you for your comments, for your interventions, and I hope that your involvement in observing the situation in Belarus will remain in place, and that our cooperation will give Belarusian people more hope to fight for their democracy and for their rights that we are discussing today. Dainius, back to you. Thank you, Petras. Thank you, participants of the first session. And now we go to the second part of our session, which is important because of the two reasons. The right of expression, journalism in Belarus. I often speak that the right of expression is the right of people to be themselves, and journalism is a profession that has a privilege to use the freedom of expression more than others. And this is also the profession that suffers mostly, because when we face with anti-democratic regimes. So this is quite a difficult choice, I would say. I am happy that Ginas Dabašinskas, a professional moderator, will take over the moderation of this session. Ginas, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, Ginas. I'm happy to be with you here today. Let me congratulate everyone with the day of the restoration of the Lithuanian press. And I see a highly logical structure We have political processes discussed in this conference with some affiliations related to political society. And the second session of this conference, as we heard, is about journalism and self-expression. It's like a mirror which does not just passively reflect what's going on, but also which formulates responsibility, accountability, and some forecasts where the process leads to. So that level, I believe, is no less important, and they both are closely interrelated. I could go on talking about it. However, the more I live in a democratic state, the more I clearly understand that sticking to the rules is an alphabet. Even if you have a very big wish, sometimes you still have to look at what is prescribed by the rules. Now I would like to give the floor to the chairman of the Belarusian Association of Journalists. We have 4 presenters in this part of our conference, so if we have time, we can have a discussion together. Mr. Andrei, can you hear us?
Да, конечно, спасибо. Вы меня слышите тоже, надеюсь?
Taip, girdime. Tai jums žodis 7
Yes.
minutės. 7 minut.
We can hear you.
Так, уже, так сказать, повелось.
7 minutes, if you don't mind.
Добрый день, господа и дамы.
Good afternoon.
Коллеги, друзья, спасибо за возможность выступить здесь. Еще больше благодарны
Thank you
за
for
то,
the
что эта тема
possibility
сегодня вынесена
to
на
participate in this conference,
Потому что такая
and thank you
получается
for discussing this
ситуация, вот у нас
particular
сейчас сплошные
topic.
праздники.
That's the
Например, в Литве
situation.
праздник печати.
We are only celebrating today. In Lithuania, you are celebrating the Day of Restoration of
3
the
мая
Lithuanian press.
Всемирный
In
день свободы
Belarus,
слова. 5 мая
we have the Day of Radio. On the 3rd of May, we celebrated the World Press Freedom Day, and our routine is quite different from holidays, though. On the 3rd of May, the civilized world celebrated the World Press Freedom Day, whereas on the next day, the Ministry of Information of the Republic of Belarus issued an official warning to the regional newspaper Index Press from Baranovichy for publishing an interview with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. And on the 5th of May, the Economic Court of the Brest Oblast fined the newspaper's editorial office with almost €1,500 for distributing the information, which was called extremist. At the same time, the police began checking the publication under Article 361 of the Criminal Code of the Republic of Belarus, calls to actions aimed at harming the national security of the Republic of Belarus. Belpochta refused to include the newspaper in the subscription catalog, and Belsoyuz Press refused to sell it through kiosks. It's not an isolated accident. The ban on printing and distributing newspapers since August last year was confronted by print publications, in fact. The publications like People's Will, Bell Gazette, Free News Plus, even Komsomolskaya Pravda in Belarus, Slonimskaya Gazeta, Brestskaya Gazeta were banned. Most of them had to stop printing and switch to the internet instead. But, as we have already heard today, the freedom of speech is severely restricted
restricted.
недоступны в Беларуси, и доступ к которым здесь ограничивается.
Authorities have blocked access to almost 100
Администраторы
independent online publications.
телеграм-чатов, каналов преследуются, в том числе и в
YouTube,
уголовном
Telegram
порядке.
are also restricted, as well as the local chat rooms and social media commentators.
Медиапортал вообще-то номер один. Он лишен статуса СМИ был в конце
One of the biggest
прошлого года.
websites in Belarus has been stripped of media status.
Но, в принципе, независимо от того, есть этот статус или нет, журналисты подвергаются постоянному
The pressure on journalists has also increased. They are being persecuted on a daily basis. And about 500 of journalists were detained last year. About 100 were arrested. This has been going on until now. 11 journalists and media professionals are imprisoned with criminal charges. Three of them, Katerina Andreeva, Daria Shultsova, and Katerina Borisevich, have already been sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 6 months to 2 years for their ordinary journalistic activities, their professional duties. Shultsova and Andreeva have been providing coverage from protests on the streets. Katerina Borisevich learned that one of the opposition activists was murdered and gave the coverage. She was detained just for disclosing the doctor's information. Arrests, fines, searches, seizure of equipment, violence against journalists have become a practice of their professional activities. Today I am able to talk to you through Zoom platform. However, a few months ago, all our devices were seized. We still haven't got some equipment back. I am constantly invited to various interrogations. Some of my colleagues are in prison today, who are interrogated not as often as their colleagues who are still not detained.
Да, и это все, между прочим, получает освящение.
What I would also like to note is that all that is also covered by state media, and they are using a hard language of enmity, accuse people who cannot defend themselves of all kinds of crimes, spread explicit propaganda, including pro-Russian one. Representatives of the media community will not announce their appeal to state bodies. And these are the cases when the secret of research allows the authorities present the false information. Russian and Belarusian propaganda are working jointly together. Now they have a joint project which is directed against social media. So the conditions that we are facing now is nothing like a festive occasion. This is kind of Belarusian norm, which is not normal, far from it. 1 hour ago,
белорусских журналистов, редакторов, известных в медиапространстве людей
A statement of about 100 journalists and editors was publicized. These are all well-known people, and it's called "Put an end on witch hunting," because what we are facing now is really witch hunting. It's also related to journalists and bloggers, the ones who are posting information on social media, including politicians. Any citizen, when people who think differently are persecuted, and social media workers have publicized their demands, including free their colleagues, bring back the non-state media to the common media space, put an end to the interference by state bodies in the media and administrative pressure imposed on journalists and media. These are the conditions guaranteed by international documents and commitments that Belarus has undertaken. Thank you so much for having the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you very much. And now I believe that the questions can be asked later on after other presentations. Now I would like to give the floor to Natalia Frolova, who is a journalist for The Insider. She lives in Lithuania. Well, the question was raised whether it is time to speak about Russia, because Natalia Frolova is from Russia originally. But actually the issues of media in Belarus and Russia are Belarus and Russia are very similar. Yes, the Russian independent media and Belarusian independent media are on the same side and suffer the same situation, because the government of both the countries work hand in hand. And in this situation, it is difficult to compare, of course, the situation of the Belarusian journalists with those of Russian. We see the situation, we follow that. It is a very aggravating situation. But we can really envy you in Belarus, because many people in your country and many journalists, as far as I understand, as far as my experience shows, on this breakthrough, Belarusian people and journalists were able to choose the side, because you cannot remain in this gray zone anymore, because you understand when people kill people on the streets, the journalists cannot stay in the national radio and television without reacting and pretending not to notice, and therefore many journalists left their jobs at national television and radio. On the other hand, for the Belarusian media, independent media and protesters should really be happy, because they have Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, because she actually was elected as president. We do not have similar leaders. We have Navalny, who is in prison now. Well, a very small group of people still support Navalny. And in Russia, this division and split between people who disagree with the current policies of Putin and those who support him is very big. And the independent media is in support of these people who are against. And this small percentage is very much polarized with the main authorities and government. And I think the Russian authorities can more easily change the situation or fight with this opposing media because it is remain unnoticed to the general public. And it is even on a more active scale. We can speak and discuss different political reasons in Belarus and in Russia. Maybe Putin is afraid of something what happened in Belarus, while in September Russia will have elections and Putin wants to establish his further ruling period. Because last year he made this constitutional revolution, but most importantly, all those political events and developments, starting from the war in Georgia, Crimea, poisoning of Litvinenko in Skripal's situation in London, Crimea war in Ukraine, all this list could be complemented, and then attack on Navalny, bombings in Europe, provocations on the European soil. And when the journalist understands that, he realizes that he lives in a country and works as a journalist in a country where the authorities are criminals actually. And in this situation, it is very difficult to be objective as a journalist. To be on the other side. And at some point, journalists cannot observe the principles of the BBC, for example, working in a war zone, and speak about the opinion or the position of the Russian or, say, Ukrainian troops. The Russian press, independent Russian media finds it very difficult to be independent because it is in the situation where there is a war, a social war. Independent media in Russia are very few and far between, and they are either international, financed from abroad, or just a group of Russian journalists who managed to register themselves in other countries. For example, Medusa and Insider registered in Latvia. So I believe that such examples will increase in the future. The authorities are trying to marginalize those media outlets even more and to eliminate them from this space. The government is always trying to improve its repressive mechanisms that were established some years ago. While the law on international agents exists since 2012, different organizations, non-commercial organizations, public organizations fell under this title, and they were forced to be closed because they could not receive funding. And these were organizations that were helping people. From the beginning of this year, this list of international agents included media outlets and individuals, bloggers, for example, who write something on social media. They can be recognized as foreign agents just because they have a number of followers. And we have 19 points in this list. Голос Америки and American Voice, Radio Free Europe also were included on this list. Medusa was also recognized as a foreign agent. Sometime before, people understood that they live at risk, but it is very difficult to understand how the adopted laws will be applied in specific situations. And sometimes the situation is that, for example, some threat can be avoided. And this flexibility that I've just mentioned is used for media and for fighting free media. With Medusa, we see the situation when sponsors are no more, cannot support them anymore. It is reflected on the listeners who will be. And this is a new law on the information, which is very vague, and it is very difficult to understand it, and its application is very flexible. All these threats, growing threats, and something mentioned by Professor Benedek, when foreign journalists are not granted accreditation, all those negative factors are increasing, and the situation is very gloomy. Very many journalists dream to leave the country because they really feel pressure. They're afraid to be, and it is very difficult for them to survive under this pressure. And finally, the conclusions and the outcomes are very sad. We had a situation, we had an example when one journalist was endlessly persecuted. Thank you very much for your presentation. Since we are out of time, we could continue, but unfortunately we have to stop here. Now, I would like to give the floor to Hanna Lubakova, the Belarusian journalist in exile. The floor is yours.
Hello. I'll switch
Hello.
to my presentation. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for organizing this important conference. First of all, I was asked to speak a little bit about Katerina Andreeva and Daria Shevtsova, who are both a TV journalists who have been sentenced to 2 years in prison for just live streaming from a protest. They're journalists from Balsa TV and my friends, brilliant professionals. And in order to start, I'll start with Katerina's words that she told her husband when they met in Zhodina prison. She said that imagine how these officers feel when they understand that they fought against the Goros and lost in this war. It clearly shows, and I do agree that security forces actually lost here. Firstly, Katerina and Daria are heroes, and everyone perceives them so. They receive a lot of support from people and all over the world. And secondly, they are the bravest. They are courageous. On November 15, when Katerina Andreeva and Daria Shevtsova were arrested and when security forces broke into the apartment from which they were live streaming, reporting on a protest, Katya said that they had a chance to escape. They had another apartment, which was not exposed and where they could kind of live and hide there. But when they saw all these security forces who arrived and began kind of suppressing, dispersing protesters who gathered at this Ploshche Peremen, at this Change Square, where Roman Bondarenko was commemorated, where was this national memorial, they decided to stay in that apartment and perform their professional duties. And I would say that this is something that represents, that clearly symbolizes what independent journalism in Belarus is, because they are dedicated to their cause, dedicated to their profession, and they understand their mission to spread information, to report truthfully on events, and help people get access to facts, data, and know, and explaining to people what's happening in the country. Katya and Dario represent not only their media outlets, but they shape how news media is perceived by different parts of the public, because they're strong and resilient, and that's how journalism in Belarus currently perceived as well. So people in Belarus understand the value of free speech in media. They respect independent journalists. They tried to protect us many times by surrounding us in circles when police arrived and wanted to detain us, or they let us in their apartments when also security forces arrived, and so that we could use Wi-Fi because there was internet shutdown. So people perceive us as allies, and they kind of also try to help us. The citizen journalism became really important. That's how I report at this moment, because while people in Belarus on the ground, witnesses send me information, send me videos and pictures, and some kind of insights, and that's how I can report. As if I was there myself. So that's kind of this optimistic part of it, this positive part of it. There is also a kind of dark side. If you look at the case of Igor Osik or Katerina Borisevich or Press Club, when Igor Osik was detained last June, we thought that he would be released immediately because his charges were really kind of false, and we did not believe that it's possible to kind of, detain a person for this. On the same day when he was detained, a criminal case was launched against him, and the former Interior Minister Yuri Karayev explained that he was detained. He was among those bloggers who organized protests through YouTube and Telegram. So we immediately understood that there would be a war against us, basically. The regime always treated independent media in Belarus as something that they would kind of prefer not to see, something that is not needed. But now it's just, I would say, some sort of extermination. They just simply want us to not exist in Belarus at all. I was asking myself why journalists and bloggers have become so dangerous for the regime. And the example of Sergei Tikhanovsky, the owner of a popular Telegram channel, The Country for Life, is crucial. By the way, he announced 1 year ago that he wants to run for president. So he challenged Lukashenko by interviewing people all across the country, and they were openly saying to him that they want Lukashenko to go. And that's how people basically all over the country saw that many people are against Lukashenko. And this is not only Minsk, but also people in really small towns are against the leader. And that's something that official propaganda usually tried to hide. They wanted to show that only the capital protests and those regional folks are really kind of supporters of Alexander Lukashenko. Then Lukashenko saw that he wouldn't be able to appease people who are so angry and lower their discontent. So when Tsikhanouski announced that he wanted to run in the presidential elections, he was immediately arrested. And Lukashenko was right about his fears because state propaganda, Lukashenko himself, he's lost monopoly over people's minds in the past years, I would say, and especially in the past year, which was visible during the pandemic. Lukashenko, I think, underestimated the hunger, people's hunger for truth, and their mobilization and their politicization. This is not the society that I used to see before, I would say. And even when I traveled across the country, I saw this myself. People were so self-organized and so willing, so kind of wanting change and wanting Lukashenko to go. And I think this is not possible to stop anymore. And that's why these protests, this discontent did not disappear and will not disappear. What I find really positive is this trust and popularity, I would say, of journalists, of bloggers, who are now a really important source of information for people. And that's something that might be a kind of a very different trend from what we see around the world. In Belarus, social media is really important, I would say, for spreading information. Telegram is one of these kind of trusted sources in Belarus. So to me, well, Lukashenko lost. Repressions are now the only mean how he is able to stay in power and kind of keep control over information and over the situation. And that's why he fights so hard against journalists and bloggers in Belarus. So yeah, so I would stop here. I think it's just to finish. There are obviously the level of repressions is unprecedented, but again, the level of solidarity with journalists and bloggers, and among us, journalists and bloggers in Belarus, is also unprecedented. So we try to support each other, and people also try to support us, and that's something that gives me a lot of hope.
Ačiū ponai Hanai Liubakovai už įdomias įžvalgas. Likite su mumis.
Thank you, Madam Lyubakova, for interesting insights. Please stay with us. Maybe some questions will follow. And now the last speaker on this panel, Nastasia Yaman.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the first place, I'd like to thank organizers of this event, as well as members of Lithuanian and European parliaments for multidimensional and continuous support of free media in Belarus. And it's really pleasant to notice that more than 10 Lithuanian parliamentarians joined the initiative MP for Freedom. Remarkably that 4 of them, including Dalia Asanavičiūtė, Viktorija Čmilytė-Nilsen, took symbolic godparenthood over Belarusian journalists. It's Daria Chiltsova, Igor Losik, Katerina Borisevich, and Yulia Slutskaya. Thank you very much for the solidarity expressed. Last year was not to blame for turning the life of reporters in Belarus into hell. A long time ago, in 1997, it was a really bad sign when a journalist became one of the first ever political prisoners in Belarus, and his name was Pavel Sharamet. Since then, day-to-day responsibilities like acquiring official information, street interviews, performing investigations turned into a challenge for Belarusian independent media. Even if outlet has a registered status, it can feel free. It is constantly jeopardized. And an editor always needs to think first before he will publish something critical towards the state vertical structures. But eventually, this is what happened in 2020 to almost every free Belarusian media. For instance, accreditation of Belarusian Service of Radio Liberty was revoked, and the most popular website, Tutbai, as already Andrei Bastunes mentioned, it lost its official status of the media outlet. Undoubtedly, having accreditation in today's Belarus doesn't guarantee safety for any journalists under current conditions, when the constitution or any other law is just simply a matter of interpretation for authorities. There's a media project on the web called August 2020, which collects terrifying stories of repressed people in Belarus. But I think that journalists can publish its own book about disregard, about violations, and about violence towards them. We can still remember the detention of Ruslan Kulevich. It's a journalist from Grodno. During his detention, his both arms were broken by police, and he was shocked so much that he didn't even notice that. A vest with the title "Press" in the war zones usually serves to save lives of journalists, save their health. But last year in Belarus, this vest became something quite the opposite. At peaceful protests, it became a target for a police hunt. That is how Nasha Niva reporter Natalia Lubnievskaya got shot in her leg with a rubber bullet. And we can still remember a reporter from Netherlands who got injured in her leg with a flashbang grenade. And of course, after this great representation of Andrei Bastonets, we still remember the sealed door of Belarusian Association of Journalists after it was searched with regard to a criminal case. Nowadays, loyalty, lack of initiative, and total being under command are the main warful features for a legitimate ruler. This winter, Alexander Lukashenko awarded several state media authors who were especially active in justifying violence. State television correspondent Grigor Azaronek got a medal for bravery, and Igor Tur was awarded with a reward of Francisc Skarina name, the first pressman in Grand Duchy of Lithuania. He would basically cry, I think. Today, my colleagues in Minsk and other cities don't give up on their job duties. However, it looks more like underground work than a typical journalistic routine. We can't follow YouTube streams anymore. Now the streams are officially a criminal offense. Instead, my colleagues tend to hide while they observe street events. Some of them regularly change rented apartments just to prevent detention or to postpone it, probably. I cannot find appropriate words to support mom of Dasha Chultsova. She received a drawing from Dasha. I have it here. It's with a big mother bear. And Dasha painted it in Zhodina prison. Dasha is 24. She already serves her 2 years imprisonment term. It was already mentioned that she, together with Katerina Andreeva, was detained during the live stream in November. By the way, they are both recognized extremists in the prison already. On Katya's personal file, in no uncertain terms, it's written Zmaharka, or fighter. That is the word state propaganda usually uses regarding protesters for a long time already. Katya's husband, Igor, got an opportunity to talk to her through a glass partition in April, for the first time since November. He said that she stays in cheerful spirits. However, she felt COVID symptoms, but no one cares to test in the prison. We wait for Katya Borisevich, the Dubai journalist, to be released on 19th of May, after serving a 6-month prison term. It will be a big happy day, but it won't be a day of victory, although. 10 more journalists are kept behind bars. At least a dozen of bloggers are as well. Strong support of each of them from abroad means a lot. Permanent media stories on Belarus and parliamentarians' attention keep imprisoned Belarusian journalists on the spot. So thank you for that, and I believe it will be proceeding, and this pressure brings close the day when the last journalist will be released from behind the bars. Thank you so much.
Ačiū, ponai Anastasijai. su didžiausiu malonumu norėčiau.
Thank you, Anastasia. I would be glad to add something and ask a question, but I will instead give the floor to the moderator, Darius Radzevičius, who will introduce the third part of our discussion, where we probably will have a chance to ask questions. Well, the discussion is extremely important for us here today, and not only for us, because we speak about the future. I was quite happy that Dalia Asanavičiūtė is going to moderate the discussion. She is in the Seimas today, and political leadership is very important, I believe. But in Dalia's case, I think her life experience is very important also in trying to understand that not all the people can live in their own country for some reason. She herself lived abroad for many years, and my remark is the more totalitarian regime presses on people to stay in their own country, to shut from the rest of the world, the practice shows that we have more and more people who become the citizens of the world. And I hope that Dalia will find many interesting points to mention in the discussion. Thank you, Dainius. As an immigrant, I have repeatedly heard that Lithuania probably pushed us away. But speaking about Belarusians and their fight for freedom, I can say that no, Lithuania has never pushed us away. It just opened the borders when we became the member of the European Union, and we have a choice. And I think Belarusians now have the right to choose their future and their president, even though sometimes in Lithuania we complain we have chosen the wrong ones. Again, Belarusians don't have that chance at all. We have been speaking about the current time when people are beaten, when they disappear. When in Ireland, I have had the chance to meet young people from Belarus at the end of August. Last year, we were standing united with flags in our hands. I often heard the request from those people, please don't put my name on social media, because I want to see my mom, my children, I want to visit my home country, which sounds quite unbelievable to us now. Lithuania has made its way, the way to independence. Belarusians are doing that now, and what we can do is to support them, to stretch our hand of help. So I would now like to speak about the future. Maybe I will just change the procedure, if I may, because I have wonderful people who can speak about the vision of the future, about the strategy. I will ask them to make a short introduction, and then I will ask a question. I'm really glad to give the floor to Karin Karlsbro from Sweden, a member of the European Parliament, the deputy chair of the Group for Interparliamentary Relations with Belarus. So, Karin, what is the vision from the perspective of the European Parliament?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you to the Lithuanian Parliament and to all colleagues and friends in Lithuania and Belarus. I'm sure one day Belarus will be a free country. I'm fully convinced of that for several reasons. The people have shown an extraordinary courage and determination not to give up before they have their freedom. And as we all know a regime built on violence, on oppression and lies has no future. But it's important that we keep up the international attention to what's going on. And without free media and without free journalists who can do their job, the truth is in danger. Our message from the European Parliament and from the European countries must be very, very clear. Journalism is not a crime. All journalists has to be released, as well as all political prisoners, of course. But until the oppression and violence towards journalists, as well as ordinary citizens, has stopped, we must continue to put pressure on the regime. And all of you who provide us with the truth and the information play a key role, because without your job, we can't do our job. And I really appreciate the network of activists all over Europe, in Sweden, but in all European countries, who provide us with information on a daily basis or every week with the truth of what's going on in Belarus. And without the truth, we can't act. So we have to do this together. And I will also underline that we should not be naive, because from the experience from my own country the latest months, you have to continue to spread information among media, among journalists, among influencers of the truth, what's going on in Belarus, because suddenly happen things that make you shocked. For example, just if I may give you an example, when the Belarusian state TV was invited to be part of the international jury in the national Eurovision competition in Sweden, it was a shock to all of us how this could happen. We all know the president for the state TV channel is on the European Union sanctions list. He has nothing to do in a Swedish music competition. So I think what you provide us when free journalists are not free, the information, the truth, which all of you who act in different ways provide us with on Twitter, on blogs, what you write and all what you do. The truth is the tool to support a free Belarus. And as I said in the beginning, I'm fully sure that freedom will come.
Ačiū, miela Karin. Ir aš norėčiau užduoti jums šiek tiek provokuojantį klausimą.
Thank you, Karin. I would like to ask you a provocative question, if I may.
Nes jau įgyvendinti 3 sankcijų paketai.
Question about the sanctions, because the 3 packages of sanctions have been already applied. We should not be naive. As you said, Lithuania is not naive. And the list of sanctions that Lithuania proposes is more wider. Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya is asking for the 4th package of sanctions. Why the European Union is not so willing to apply it, and what position is going to take in the further stages, do you think?
I fully support wider and tougher sanctions. And it's just to admit that the European Union, the member states together, they have acted too slowly with not enough courage for a long time. We were satisfied that in the end we saw the new sanctions list last year, but it's far away from enough. and it was too late. So I will try together with colleagues to push for this. And I think it's urgent. And what's going on in Belarus right now shows how important it is. And I know that Lithuania is really a front runner on this. And I think we have to work together to achieve this. It's so important.
Ačiū labai. Manau, yra puiku žinoti, kad Baltarusija turi Europos parlamente.
Excellent to know that Lithuania has friends in the European Parliament, not only from Lithuania, but other countries as well. Thank you, Karin.
Prašyti tarti žodį
Now I'd like to give the floor to Mantas Adomėnas, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is responsible for Belarus. Vice Minister, criminal persecution is applied against Belarusian journalists just for carrying out their responsibilities. You said so. So you know the situation and you can really comment on that. Thank you very much. When we speak about a threat to the freedom of freedom of expression and freedom of press, well, I found this on my chair. Please do not sit down here. Please do not sit down. So this is my wish for the Belarusian journalists, don't be put to prison. While preparing for this forum, I will step aside a little bit and speak about possible scenarios, about possible geopolitical developments. And then I will return to media journalists and how we can help them. Now we have 4 scenarios of the development of Belarus for some time that actually compete among each other. The first one, and the most depressive, is the scenario that can be called the Venezuela scenario. But actually in Venezuela we have the scenario of Belarus. This could be called new normal or déjà vu scenario, when the regime manages to remain. The pressure coming from different sides, from the east, for some negative transformation manages to preserve its power and the illusion of control. I think that this is an illusion, and it can be sustained for a rather long time. While the constitutional amendments are being drafted and they are in line with Lukashenko's wishes, the fatigue among the Western countries can be noticed. The sanctions remain, but actually the same situation in the vicious circle repeats: rigged elections, violence against the population, and Belarus is moving towards Russia. This would be a very depressive scenario, and we should not accept the new normal. The second scenario is the Russia-controlled authorities. We can see pro-Russian parties and the birth of pro-Russian parties in Belarus. The constitutional reform in these circumstances could give the floor to fluent replacement of Lukashenko with another personality from the east. Pseudo-democratic elections are held when the candidates are pro-Russian, and this would be useful to appease fighters for democracies. And the West thinks that the absence of Lukashenko is the end of the headache. But actually, this is the scenario of total control of Belarus by Russia and pseudo-democracy. with the Western funding. The third scenario is the scenario of synchronization of state systems on various levels by the end of the year, and possible solutions that Lukashenko often mentions. These would be very fateful decisions in Lukashenko's life, and this would mean the creation of the Union state. This would be bad news for people in Belarus, because the authoritarian regime would remain. This would remain for a very long period. And the fourth scenario, which is that we want very much, includes dialogue with the Coordination Council, elections with a new commission and international observers for the election. Well, actually, we see this on the horizon, but this horizon is very distant. All these four scenarios are on our menu for a very long time, but our question is which scenario will be implemented. And I would like to say that we should not succumb to fatalism. This resistance means that we have a potential for change. We need to have patience and we need to be brave. So it all depends on the civic society, on renewed protests, new forms of protest probably. It would depend on the pressure from democratic world and the media. And now returning back to the media. The media is something which disseminates the free word to Belarusian people. We can help the media and journalists working in complicated circumstances. Without the support and tools that we can offer, we should also define several important areas that our ministry works at. First, recording violations. This is extremely important. The Justice Hub and creation of this Justice Hub, which records and legally evaluates those violations. Independent group of experts established in the US in February is a very important factor here. One more important aspect is intolerance to impunity. We have 4 countries that support us and support our reaction to the violations in Belarus. Belarus's accountability platform as a legal platform helps to record the violations and help accountability for them. And the last point is pressure. UNESCO, United Nations, OEC formats raise this issue of Belarus, raises the issue of Belarus on a constant basis. And sanctions, which are are effective as far as this nervous reaction of Belarusian leaders shows. Sanctions are effective, therefore they will have to be expanded. We should not stop, we should maintain our course. And I think that the regime is cracking, and this is a sign which shows that we have to continue our efforts. And together with the help of independent media and independent journalists, we will be able to attain victory. Please, may you not be put in prison.
Puikia asociacija ir labai paprasta ir labai aiški ir susiveda viskas.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Žodžius. Iš tikrųjų, tai jūs atkartojate tą, ką ir mūsų pašnekovai kalbėjo, Rostov Kužel ir Hanna Liubakova ir Vytis Jurkonis, kad reikalingas spaudimas įvairiomis platformomis, įgyvendinant ir ketvirtąjį sankcijų paketą.
In applying the fourth package of sanctions so that the democratic elections take place as soon as possible. And the fourth scenario that everyone is looking forward is very significant. But what journalists have mentioned is Lithuania really ready to support?
Bet kalba ir apie tai, kad žurnalistai, jie neturi ir finansinių resursų.
Because journalists don't have financial resources, they need equipment, they need even procedures in place so that they could freely work further. So my question is as follows. On the 10th of May, Ministers of Foreign Affairs are meeting in Brussels. What does the Ministry of Foreign Affairs expect? And another question is very simple. Can we help not only by inserting the pressure, but also maybe give some financial support or in terms of equipment? The issue of Belarus will be discussed next Monday by ministers of foreign affairs of the European countries. This is the question that ministers come back to now and again. The progress of the fourth package of sanctions will be also discussed. The meeting dedicated exceptionally to Belarus is planned for June this year, where we also expect the participation of the opposition leader of Belarus. The fourth package of sanctions is moving forward, is being moved forward at the end of May. We can expect a more ambitious set of sanctions compared to what it looked before. And of course, as far as the support to journalists is concerned, we are doing really a lot, but I will be able to tell you about that in private. Thank you, Vice Minister. As we heard, Lithuania has a clear set of values, and thank you to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Andrius Pulokas, Lithuania's ambassador in Belarus. Maybe I will ask a question later, but without leaving our own citizens forgotten or neglected, because we do have Lithuanian citizens in Belarus. What is their position? And do they also experience any pressure or repressions from the regime? Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for the opportunity to take part in this event. I am the ambassador, but I am in Vilnius. And it probably serves to show that in our neighboring country, the historic neighbors, not everything is well there today, and that the country is living in enormous pressure conditions. And if we now discuss the future, I can just look back, let's say 1 year ago, when everything seemed a bit differently. I can just state that this balance, the tension between the authorities and ordinary people, society representatives, is tremendous, is massive. I can just say that the progress has been made by both the parties, and I would like to focus mostly on the regime, what it has done to its civil society. Even though sometimes when joking, I can say that a book could be released on how to quench any democratic changes. It could be a manual of the 21st century on how one should behave. And the manual would probably consist of two sections. First, coercion. Second, propaganda. We have already discussed today that the bottom line seems to be reached. However, every day we hear now and again about new developments, creative ways and methods, to put it this way, to quench any free thought, any different opinion. Unfortunately, the distance between the regime and the Belarusian society is huge. But the civil society has made a very impressive progress. I think this is a historical achievement, and we are going to discuss it for many years to come, because the Belarusian nation has been born. The civil society. And I also see some new trends even in journalism. As I know, many people have many acquaintances working as journalists. I see the unique phenomenon of journalists' solidarity. In democratic countries, we are used to the situation when journalists are not always agreeing on different subjects. And this is quite normal, I would say. But in Belarus, all journalists are in solidarity, whereas on the other side, you see the executors of propaganda. The four scenarios mentioned by Vice Minister are quite realistic, in fact, and much will depend on how the two political systems or components of the real life, which is the regime and the civil society, will progress further. And here we speak about things which are of topical importance on every day. As an ambassador, I could also mention one element we haven't touched upon today, which is the isolation of the state and the public and the society. Let us understand that Belarusian people are facing difficulties to leave the country, whereas the opportunities to travel are probably one of the essential conditions for the people, for the country. And even the process of issuing visas seems to be extremely complicated. Due to the coronavirus, Belarus is going to be completely shut, because the people of that country will not have Schengen visas in the future, and Lithuania and Poland will not have an opportunity to issue the visas. promptly to them. So now I think it's time to think about how we are going to address this problem, because we do have some ideas how to do it. We need to understand is that both Lithuania and Poland are the key countries that have guaranteed some exit to Europe, gate to Europe to Belarusian people, and we have to secure that further. I would also be in favor with other discussions like liberalization of the visa regime, maybe refusing any fee, any visa issuance fee. We need to show to Belarusian people some clear signals that we haven't forgotten them, not just in our statements, but in our specific actions. Another point I would like to mention is related to the COVID situation. Belarus cannot boast on very big achievements in terms of vaccination. I know that only 3% of people have been vaccinated, have received the first jab in Belarus, the country that has been denying the threat of the pandemic is definitely facing big difficulties today. And you know, Belarus has always had a lot of problems as far as statistics is concerned. We don't know the exact scale, but we can understand that situation is really tragic there. So we should really sit and think how we can help the country with vaccination, particularly the active part of population who could probably go to other European countries and have a chance to get vaccinated there. I think these are the matters that we need to address on a daily basis, because this is something that ordinary people are facing. It is the seventh month now that I have been in Vilnius already, and this is why I don't feel exactly the pulse what's going on in Belarus. But from all my contacts and all the flow of information that I receive is that people's determination for changes is not decreasing. Maybe it's just gaining new forms with the new waves of repressions in view of the atmosphere of fear, and the causes to be looking forward to freedom are still in place. I do believe in the fourth scenario. I believe it's inevitable, and it's probably just a matter of time when it's going to be implemented. Seizing this opportunity, let me just wish strength and perseverance to all the Belarusian people and journalists in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency Ambassador. You really touched an important topic about visas. Since September last year, Belarusian citizens visas are being issued to Belarusian citizens in a simplified procedure. A number of humanitarian visas in a simplified procedure have been issued. So you should say that we should liberalize the issuing of visas. Well, something that we have now is in line with the demand, because the pandemic situation is very tense, and the issuing of visas on the EU level is being halted. Only labor visas and humanitarian visas are being issued. I have in mind the period when the pandemic situation will improve. And we hope that in the second half of the year, the situation will be different and the need to travel for people will emerge. Well, one more question I asked, what about our citizens in Belarus? Well, the number of Lithuanian citizens is very small. We have the Lithuanian community. These are mostly Belarusian citizens, but of Lithuanian origin. We are very much concerned and we follow the policies of Belarus towards our Polish neighbors, when Polish schools are being closed, when Polish representatives are being put in prison with investigations carried out. Well, I cannot say that the situation is similar with Lithuanian origin citizens, but the situation is very complicated overall. But people are used to that. The situation in Belarus, and this was mentioned today, that this situation has been for a long time like this, and this existence in the authoritarian regime was taken for granted by many people in Belarus as a way of survival, a method of survival. This is something that is usual for people. Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador. And now I would like to give the floor to our last speaker, Anatol Lebedka. He is representative of the opposition against Lukashenko. He has been raising confrontations with the Belarusian authorities. He has been arrested for several times for participating in different protests and rallies. He was for several times accused of provocations against smear campaigns against Lukashenko. You saw the entire process, you've been following the process for so many years. How has the situation changed? The civic society, as I've already been mentioned, has reinforced, has become stronger. People are intimidated, but they have courage to go to the streets. So the floor is yours, Mr. Lebedko.
Mikrofonas.
Please switch on your microphone.
Labas rytas. Ačiū.
Good morning.
Всем моим друзьям, всем
I
организаторам
thank my
этого
friends,
важного
the organizers of this important
Я
event.
также имею какое-то отношение
I also have some
к
relation to the
теме
topic
журналистики.
of
Иногда
journalism.
бываю практикующим блогером.
Sometimes I become
Сегодня в первой
a
половине
blogger,
дня
and
как раз
in the morning
выпустил
today
передачу,
I released
которая посвящена
a program that is
22
dedicated
года, как эскадроном смерти был похищен и убит
to the
Юрий Захаренко. Привожу этот пример для того, чтобы
killing of
акцентировать
Yuri
внимание, что
Zakharenko.
проблемы прав и свобод
The problem
граждан
of
Беларуси
human rights and
возникли не в
violations of
прошлом
human
году,
rights
гораздо
occurred not last year, but
раньше. И
much
я думаю,
earlier.
если бы
And I
в
think that if
1996 году
in
мы, белорусы
1999
и международное
we
сообщество
Belarusians and the
были более
international
последовательны и
community
решительны
had
своей
been
рефлексии на
more
антиконституционный референдум, который провел
resolute
Лукашенко,
against
то
Lukashenko's
мы не позволили бы ему
revolution,
за эти десятилетия
he wouldn't be
укрепить свой
allowed
режим
to strengthen and
и
reinforce
сделать
his
его
regime and to make it a challenge not only for millions of Belarusians, but also to our neighbors and the entire international community. Therefore, we have to admit our own mistakes too. Yes, in 2000, I was a rather young politician. My opposition activities in the beginning of the 90s began. Over this time, we had many scenarios. Well, I basically agree with the 4 scenarios that were proposed by Mr. Adomėnas. But an important question, what is the level of possibility of one or another scenario? It depends on many factors and objectives and tasks of major political actors is actually a determining factor. Another factor is the economic situation. Which side will the economy take? This is a decisive factor, because there have always been a group of people who are reacting by their stomach, and this is the electorate, the voters in Belarus. And the third factor, the major factor, where will the Belarusian issue be raised in the international community? And therefore, the coalition between Washington and Brussels is needed now, because this might be a very important factor that could determine one of the 4 scenarios. Kremlin is also a factor, because Mr. Putin can also be a backing force for Mr. Lukashenko. When we speak about sanctions, this is a possible instrument against possibly the Russian Federation, the Kremlin and Putin. But they could be also used by Putin to support the legitimate ruler of Belarus. This support of the toxic Lukashenko could weaken Kremlin's position. Speaking about the civic society, yes, we are witnessing of an opening of the entire nation, of all the people. I'm impressed. I've never imagined that this could happen. And what happened? And one word changed, actually. For a very long time, I had been welcomed by my compatriots asking one question: when you do something with the regime of Lukashenko? And last year I joined my compatriots who would tell me, we are really a force. And you can see the difference, because previously people would say you, and now they started saying we. This change from you to we is a good development, when people no longer expect for some kind of external power to come from Vilnius, Warsaw or Berlin to help them do something. People understood that they have to take responsibility for what is happening on our soil. I would like to voice several of my ideas in relation to what should be done. We should, yes, support the society. These are very important.
с помощью наших литовских друзей
with the help of our Lithuanian partners in national parliaments, we should establish provisional groups, parliamentary groups in different parliaments for the democratic Belarus. And we have Mr. Paviljonis, who is responsible for such group in the Seimas. And all these groups could form the umbrella organization, umbrella community, and they could be responsible and supportive of journalists, media representatives. Well, the worst thing is when people do not do anything, and even the small effort is meaningful, and I hope that other national parliaments could establish similar parliamentary or provisional groups for the democratic Belarus. I have an idea of holding the marathon of solidarity with Belarusian bloggers, and I would like to invite famous bloggers from different countries, Lithuania, Ukraine, Russia, Poland, in order to make their voice heard in Belarus. So if we have Lithuanian bloggers who are ready to take part in this marathon of solidarity, you are welcome. Please inform me, and I think that this will be a very good event, an effective event that can be implemented. And finally, in terms of scenarios, what is happening now in Belarus? We see deprofessionalization of the system of government, especially the force bloc. We have been noticing that the Belarusian policies are described by generals, military generals, who received their titles in the recent years, and they received them for repressions and suppressing demonstrations, and this is a selection already. These are not only military people, these are some kind of ideological successors of people who worked in concentration camps. We had a general called Karpenkov who made a political statement or manifesto of the current authorities. And he urged and invited to react to each protester as to Bin Laden. But I'm happy that the support of such generals to Lukashenko is very unnoticeable. And finalizing on the optimistic note, we have a fantastic situation. We have a leader that was voted for by many people. And in recent months, Lukashenko hasn't offered any idea to change the balance of powers. Yes, the situation in Belarus reminds the partisan war. Mr. Lukashenko said that yes, he would hold the re-election, the presidential re-election, but he said that, well, the condition is that Biden should do the same in his country. I think that the fourth scenario that has been mentioned is our scenario, is the scenario of the future of Belarus, and I'm completely convinced that we will manage to attain that. Thank you. Thank you, Anatoly, for this
kuris vis dėlto scenarijus realiausias,
intervention.
bet
Well,
jūs jį
my
atsakėt
question
savo baigiamajame
was
žodyje,
what
kad
is the
to,
most
ko
probable
tikitės
scenario,
ten,
and you
kur
answered my
einate,
question
yra
actually
daug
in your
optimizmo ir
intervention,
vilčių, kad visi kartu ir
that you have
nueisime.
some
Ir
hopes
ką jūs
and
teisingai
many hopes,
pasakėte,
and
kai
then
iš
we
jie
will finally
pavirsta į
get
mes,
there.
keičiasi dalykai. Tai ačiū labai
Thank
Jums
you
už
very
Jūsų
much.
kovą, už
Thank you
Jūsų
for your
optimizmą, už
struggle, for your
Jūsų
optimism, for your
motivaciją
motivation
būti
to be
Baltarusiai ir būti
in
drąsiam,
Belarus,
ir
to be
būti tuo,
brave,
kuris
to be a
užveda ir
Belarusian who is
kitus
brave
sekti
and who
ir
inspires
kovoti tą
others
kovą. Tai ačiū visiems
struggle and to
pašnekovams.
fight. I
Nuostabi
thank all the
diskusija
speakers.
ir
It has been a
perduodu vairą
wonderful
gerbiamam Dainiui.
discussion, and I will
Ačiū
give the
Daliai,
floor to
ačiū,
Dainius.
Puikiems pranešėjams ir pašnekovams.
Thank you,
Matote,
Dalia. Thank you,
kiekviena diskusija apie
all the
ateitį,
participants, all the
pasakysiu iš
speakers.
savo patirties.
I can tell you from my own
Daugybė
experience
scenarijų, bet
that
vienas realiausias yra tas,
every
pagal kurį mes gyvenam ir dirbam.
situation has
Tai tas yra
alternatives,
realiausias.
but
Ir,
the
man
most
atrodo,
realistic
baigiamosios
one
pastabos šio
is
mūsų
the
renginio
situation
turėtų būti apie tai, ką planuojam
about
daryti, kaip
where
planuojam
we
gyventi,
live,
tai taip
how
greičiausiai
we
ir bus.
plan
Ir Petras
to
Auštrevičius,
proceed.
vienas iš šio mūsų forumo
So Petras Auštrevičius
dalyvių,
is one of the
organizatorių,
organizers,
Petrai,
initiators of
paties
our
įžvalgos baigiamosios po to, ką
today's
girdėjom, ir
forum.
ko galbūt
Maybe some
negirdėjom, bet
concluding
kas
remarks, if you can.
Ačiū Dainiau.
Thank you, Dainius. On behalf of all the organizers, I would like to thank all the participants who have found time and who presented very interesting insights. I am convinced that the targeted audience found it extremely useful, even though the message was not always optimistic or calming. We do understand what's going on and why it is going on. I can just remind you that back in the 19th century, we needed 2 uprisings in order to put the basis for the liberation of our nations in the beginning of the 21st century. I don't know how many conferences we will still need to see a free and democratic Belarusian nation that will decide how to live, what leaders to elect. But I believe that each word we are pronouncing is not empty, because we do think. And we have been discussing it with Dainius Radzevičius quite recently, that during the processes which started on the 9th of August, Belarus raised Vytis, the national emblem figure, so high as we have never raised it ourselves before. Our brothers Belarusians, who are also offsprings of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, cherishing the historical memory is also quite important. A few more things. One of the practical decisions, what we seek to achieve in the European Parliament now, perceiving that the fight may be quite long, we need to have 2 parallel ways. One, not to refuse our sanctions while talking to the regime, be principled and not go into any compromise that may turn our efforts to nothing. But on the other hand, we need to offer comprehensive support to the wide public, Belarusian people. And one of our proposals is to reduce the prices, reduce the visa fee for Belarusians, having in mind what is the average salary in Belarus. What we have done so far is insufficient. I believe this can be easily implemented, and it wouldn't be very expensive for the European Union, really. This is the step we need to make. We need to send a positive signal to Belarusian people on a continuous basis.
Second,
koordinuojame ir veikiame išvien siekdami pokyčių Baltarusijoje.
when seeking changes in Belarus, it is my wish that Belarusian people and everyone does not get tired and disillusioned. I believe that after our common efforts and victory, we will still need to take care of the necessary reforms. And this may require a lot of efforts. Next, since we have important dates related to the restoration of our press and our speech, I would like to say that journalists, the bloggers who are experiencing persecution and all the pressure, who are being detained, have to understand that future streets will be named after them someday. This will be the fact that we will be proud of. And let me just assure you that your deeds and what you are doing today, being bloggers, being journalists, is extremely significant. While being on your side, let me assure you that the future generations will properly appreciate what you are doing. However, speaking about the scenarios, we have to choose the scenario which will be most favorable to Belarusian nation. And let us not be frightened by the East, because the East has only one scenario: to abolish the independence and subjugate the country to the interests of Kremlin. I thank you once again for the organizers of this conference. It was a great pleasure to work with you. Żyve Belarus!
Thank you, Petras. I have to say one important thing. I remember crossing Lithuania. Petras Auštrevičius headed a very important committee or office. It should have been called the ministry, I guess, and he continues his efforts till this day. Europe as our home is expanding constantly, and before giving the floor to Dalia, we should not forget that it's Friday, and we should keep that in mind. Thank you, Daniel. Well, while listening to Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, I was actually shocked by the names she named. Very often we forget about people in the country. We consider the country to be a territory, but actually a country means people, live human beings who breathe, who have families, who plan their future. And I would like to address our people in Lithuania. We should not think that this is something very distant, that it has nothing to do with us, because we have many our own problems. The nuclear power plant in Astravets is several dozens kilometers of Lithuania. People who are being tortured, who are assaulted, are close to our borders. This is something about us. We should be reminded that this is the regime that we lived in. We should not take freedom for granted, because freedom is something for which people sacrifice their lives on the other side of the border. So I invite all Lithuanian people to support those who come to Lithuania, to support journalists, And I actually recommend you holding a marathon of solidarity. This would be something small, but something meaningful. I believe that you will agree with me that the Committee on Foreign Affairs on February called on the Belarusian regime to release all the arbitrarily detained people and organize free and fair elections. I want to thank Mr. Paviljonis here in the Seimas, who actually invites us to join this patronage group. We have 3 members of parliament of Lithuania who took patronage over people: Viktorija Čmilytė-Nilsen, Žygimantas Paviljonis, Tomis Vytautas Raickevičius, Marijus Matijošaitis, Monika Šmenskienė, Audronius Ažubalis, Laima Andrikienė, Laurynas Kasčiūnas, Raimundas Lapata, Dovilė Šakalienė, Emanuelis Zingeris, and me. Therefore, I invite members of parliament to take the responsibility and help those people who are being imprisoned and who need to know that they are not forgotten, that somebody thinks about them, and that we are doing everything to have the 4th scenario in Belarus, free and fair elections. So I thank once again the organizers of the conference and the participants of the conference. Let us continue these efforts together. Well, colleagues, especially Mr. Bastunets, I'm happy to be able to see you, because Andrei remembers that more than 10 years ago we would meet as journalists in Lithuania, Journalists for Peace, with many journalists from many countries attending. And Andrei recalls that we found ways to discuss everything through sports, though not being sportsmen. Today we spoke about freedom of speech, expression, but I think that the most important thing that we should not forget human contacts, people-to-people contacts. It's more important to have 100 friends than 100 euros. In Lithuania, we have to understand that everything what we invest in our communication with our friends is a positive invention. Andrei, good luck to you, and we'll have much to do in the future. Well, if all this work is ahead of us, this means that we are ahead of a good future. Thank you very much.